Hello, all. This is your Professor Ian. This is just an update for week 7 as we move into the last part of our course. I'm here in beautiful Big Bear for a couple days with my family, trying to have a little vacation that is COVID-19 safe. We figured camping would be the best option, so here we are. It's nice up here, a little cooler. Well, a lot cooler. It's like 75, 80 degrees, so it's nice. It's good to get out of the heat. I hope you're all able to take a break from the heat, turn on the air conditioning or something. Anyways, I'm just going to talk about what we did last week and then talk about what's coming up a little bit this week and next. So last week we got into another big text. We just read some selections from Homer's Odyssey, one of the most important books in the Greek tradition. And it seems, my impression is that people liked the Odyssey more than the Iliad. That's usually, when I teach this course, that's usually how students react to it. Personally, I love the adventures of the Odyssey, the craziness, Polyphemus being blinded in the cave. I mean, it's hard to beat some of these scenes. Personally, I like the Iliad, I think, more just because of the way it stages these really interesting debates about war and the value of war, the things I've been talking about. I think that the Iliad is really more invested in these things, and the Odyssey is a very different kind of tale. It is more fun in some ways. I will admit that. So let's go through what you guys were talking about in perusal in the videos. So in book 1, interesting book. The Odyssey is so interesting because we don't meet our hero until book 5, right? We start with Telemachus and Penelope on Ithaca trying to keep the suitors at bay, and then Athena arriving and telling Telemachus he should go and try to find his father and such. But before that, the book opens with an invocation of the Muses, right, where Homer is asking the Muses to help him tell his story. And, people were talking about this, and it's right, in all these big epics we've read, right, the Theogony, the Iliad, the Odyssey, even Works and Days, they all start with this invocation of the Muses, right? And as it became part of the conventions of the epic tradition, when you're approaching like epic material, you need to first ask the for guidance because it's such an important topic, right? And so in later epics, such as Milton's Paradise Lost, he does the same thing, right? He's writing, thousands of years after Homer's writing, but he does the same thing because it's part of that tradition now. One thing I would encourage you to do is look at the difference in the invocation of the Muses between the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? The Iliad's all about Achilles' anger. Remember, we talked about that last week, or, the week we talked about the Iliad, and, people were amazed by how it's about his wrath and all the bodies and all that kind of stuff, right? Whereas the Odyssey is very different. It's much more about Odysseus's cleverness and his long suffering, and the invocation of the Muses, as someone said in the comments on perusal, it's kind of like a prologue. It's very much like setting the stage for the important themes that the author is going to talk about. And so, they're very different books. The Iliad is much more about Achilles' anger. He's this great warrior with this righteous anger, and Odysseus is this wily, clever person who embodies a different kind of Greek hero. Some of the things people were talking about, so some of the places they're named are real. I didn't mean to give you the impression in my lecture that none of the places that Odysseus goes to are not, or talks about anyways, are real. Some of them are real, but it's just impossible to map where he actually goes on his journey. People have tried, but I haven't seen anything that's really satisfying to say, okay, when he's talking about the Lotus Eaters, that must be here or must be there, right? He's playing with the real geography and fantasy geography. Some other things that came up, people were talking about sacrifices. So sacrifices are all through the text we've read. Sacrifices are an important way to placate the gods and to curry favor with gods. And it is kind of weird in a way because the gods don't eat human food. They eat, manna and drink nectar, right? They have their own special god food and drink that they partake in. So they don't, when an animal is sacrificed to a god, they don't have a burger or something, right? Or chow down. This isn't like a delicious meal to them. They just find it pleasing that humans would sacrifice to them in this way. And I think it's more about the ceremony and the sacrifice in the sense that humans are giving up something to please the gods, right? The gods are kind of vain that way. And, when you look at the sacrifices, they'll talk about, sacrificing their best bull. And, bulls and cows were very expensive. They were like the most expensive animal to keep and to maintain. They still are, right? Cows are very expensive to raise and to produce. right? They're animals that are cheaper, such as sheep and pigs, right? So bulls are the most expensive to maintain and produce, and therefore sacrificing a bull is like a bigger gesture to the gods, right? And sacrifices are through all, like, I can't think of any cultures that I've read about that didn't have sacrifices, animal sacrifice to the gods, if not human sacrifice in some. If you read the Bible, the Old Testament is filled with animal sacrifice. And similarly, like the Christian God, the Judeo-Christian God does not eat hamburger, right? He's here, the God figure is beyond eating. They don't need to, gods don't eat. But it's the act of sacrificing that like piousness, right? The ceremonial pleasing of the god in that way that they find pleasurable. And again, remember, livestock was a kind of currency, very important in earlier cultures. I mean, it's still important, right? If I give you a bull, that's a lot of money. But it was even more important in pre-capitalist societies where money is not as set as, what we use now. Certainly money existed, but goods were much more important, right? Especially livestock. And livestock was a sign of, wealth as well. So other things people were talking about, Poseidon and Athena, the kind of two gods who run as poles in the Odyssey. It's really interesting because Athena is, Odysseus is very much kind of like Athena's a personification of some of the things that she represents, right? He's the wise guy who uses his wits to do things, right? And Athena is the god of wisdom and like cleverness and things like that. So very much he's one of her acolytes, if you will. And Poseidon is kind of like the bad guy in the book, in the Odyssey. One thing to remember too is that Poseidon was on the Trojan side. He liked the Trojans. He helped them build their wall. He did not want Troy to be destroyed. So when Troy's destroyed, he and in such a bad way, because we don't read about the sacking of Troy, but when Troy was sacked by the Greeks, they kind of went overboard and destroyed everything and took everybody into slavery and just took their revenge on the Trojans. And Poseidon didn't like that. So he gets his revenge on all the Greek leaders as they return. Remember, I talked about that in my lecture. A lot of them don't make it back happily. And so he's taking his revenge on them as they try to go back to their homes, because he's the god of the sea, so he can. So he's kind of, and think about Odysseus is he's the creator of the Trojan horse. He's one of the greatest heroes of the Greek side. So of course he's going to have Poseidon's anger, his wrath. So Poseidon is taking this out on Odysseus. And then when Odysseus blinds his son, that's, gets even worse. So also in book 1, Telemachus and Athena. It is interesting that Telemachus is the only one that can see that Athena is a goddess. And that's because he's pious, right? This is a sign that he's a good character. Okay, so in book 5, people were talking about the Council of Gods. It is very interesting. We see this in all the texts we've read, and this is part of what makes Zeus, right? He's like the leader of the gods rather than just like a dictator god like Kronos, right, or Uranus, who are just kind of like they weren't as human because they didn't work with other people in the same way, right? Zeus is more powerful than the other guys mostly because he has his thunderbolt, so he could destroy or at least punish anybody and throw them into Tartarus. But he chooses not to. He chooses to rule with, diplomatically, because if you had all the gods against him, that'd be pretty hard to get anything done. So, very much this kind of human version of ruling over the other gods. The nymphs, people talk about this. They are minor female gods. They're usually associated with specific places. So you'd be like a river nymph of this specific river, right? So they're like localized. And, you might think of this as, again, that kind of syncretism we've been talking about, where the Greek myths take into their family all these different local gods. So if a local village had a god they worshipped of the river, that would become a river nymph that's part of the Greek pantheon, right? So that's one way to think about how those operate. Some great imagery in book 5. Katie talked about the garden. A bunch of people talked about the imagery. And it's so different from the Iliad, right? The Iliad takes place in that, that one site, whereas the Odyssey goes all over the place and describes all kinds of different things. Kristen and Elena were talking about the feminist argument that Calypso makes, which I love this part of the Odyssey, where Calypso gets angry and says, well, why can't I take this mortal lover? Why is it okay when the gods do this, but as soon as the goddess does this, everybody turns on me? it's a wonderful moment in this book from a very patriarchal society, right? There's this very feminist moment, I would say, very feminist argument in that book, which is really interesting. And then Annette brought up the issue of Odysseus' consent. I never really thought about that before, because Odysseus is kind of trapped on Calypso's island. So is he consenting fully to having sex with Calypso? We don't know enough about what happened between them to fully say, but it is an interesting thing to bring up. Given Odysseus's how quickly he sleeps with Circe later, I'm not sure what the relationship with him and Calypso is. I always read Odysseus as just basically a womanizer, and this is part of Greek culture where men were allowed to cheat and sleep with different women, where women had to remain virtuous and faithful to their husbands. But this is interesting. This is an interesting door to open. And then, oh yeah, Chris brought up the idea of the ankles. Ankles are mentioned a lot. I have to imagine this is because, women would be mostly covered up with long robes, so you would see their arms, and they're commented on a lot too. Arms, hair, eyes are commented on. Ankles, so you would have seen ankles. You wouldn't have seen a lot of like the torso and the legs, given the way people dressed for the most part, and the modesty the women would have been expected to have at the time, right? You weren't, remember, it was a patriarchal society, so women would not have been walking around in like a bathing suit or something. So I think that's probably where that comes from. You see it in other societies too. If you read Victorian texts, English stuff, you'll see mention of ankles, and it's kind of puzzling at first, but then when you think about the way people dressed, it makes more sense. Let's see, going on to book 9, people talked about Odysseus the storyteller. And yeah, he's a wonderful storyteller. He is the silver tongue hero, right? He's a good warrior, great warrior. He's no Achilles on the battlefield, but he's also the wit and he's got the silver tongue. He's like kind of like Nestor in that way. Nestor from the Iliad, remember, the old advisor, who's also a great speaker. Odysseus is smart and witty and a good speaker and very charismatic, right? He's got all these things going for him. The Lotus Eaters, yeah. So the Lotus Eaters, this is they eat a drug. You might think of it like an opioid, like heroin or morphine or something, that kind of drug. And so they're not necessarily evil, but they're going to lull Odysseus and his men into a kind of waking slumber where they don't want to leave the island. All right, and then we get the scene with Polyphemus, the Cyclops. I like Carlos's points about the Cyclops as outsiders, right? And as I was talking about the Odyssey, right? The Odyssey is all about Odysseus meeting non-Greek people, right? Others, the other, and so they're always portrayed as less than savory, right? Or evil or threatening, right? So what is non-Greek is threatening in the Odyssey, and we see this especially with Polyphemus, right? He's a malicious figure too towards Odysseus and his men. It's a fun scene though, and imagine if you were in that audience listening to Odysseus tell this story at this big dinner, right, where he's retelling this story. It would be quite amusing too. That little joke about I'm nobody, right? It's funny and it's smart, and it would be a great story to hear. But it's a fun book. Get a taste of his adventures. And book 10, you get some more taste of his adventures, right? There was a lot of talk about the incest and incest in general. We've seen a lot of incest. And one thing to think about too is, incest was it was still like a big sin, but it wasn't as bad amongst the gods, and it wouldn't have been as bad amongst like royalty and nobility, right? Amongst normal people, incest would have been a big taboo. As it is now, but amongst like the ruling families, things have always been a little bit different. I mean, even again, going to English monarchy, first cousins would marry in order to keep things within the bloodline, right? It's all about consolidating power that way. You can see this in all kinds of different cultures. I know it's an Egyptian culture as well, but amongst the ordinary people, incest would not have been something practiced widely. Kristen talked about the fact that sea journeys were tough, and Daniel in his video talked about he was interested in Poseidon as this angry god, which is interesting. Yeah, I mean, remember how perilous sea journeys would have been at this time. These were all sail-driven crafts, and if the sea turned on, so it would have been long journeys for a very short, what we consider like a short journey. And it would have been very dangerous if things turned rough, if the sea turned rough. And the sea can be very unpredictable, especially the Aegean Sea at times. So Poseidon is seen as kind of like a temperamental figure because of that, right? He would turn on a dime and suddenly your boat was tossed and everybody died or shipwrecked or whatnot. So Poseidon is a very temperamental figure for the Greeks, and sea travel was very important for the Greeks. They were trading people. They had a very spread out island and coastal, kingdom. So sea travel was very important and yet very perilous at the same time. So that's why Poseidon is such an interesting figure in their mythology. And then skipping to book 23, I didn't give you the middle part where Odysseus is returning to Ithaca. Some interesting stuff. We missed the slaughter of the suitors, which is fun in book 22 and 21. People love this book 23, which is great. The happy ending. Rebecca said she liked the break from the violence, the war stuff we've been reading, the Iliad. Myrna talked about that great emotional moment when Penelope, embraces Odysseus. And it's fun that it's given to Penelope, right? Penelope gets this great emotional moment in the book. Again, for a book that uses a lot of female bad guys, right? The Odyssey, like Calypso, Circe, the Sirens, a lot of his enemies, not all of them. The Polyphemus is a male, but a lot of his enemies in this book are feminized. So it's interesting to see this great emotional moment given to Penelope at the end of the book. And then the rooted bed test, Alan was talking about that. It's a great moment where Odysseus has to prove, this final test. He has to, overcomes all these obstacles, and his final test to regain everything is to prove to his wife through this knowledge of their marriage and this bond that they have that he is the real Odysseus, right? So think about that, right? All this adventure, all these, slaughter and war, and the final big test is this, thing, this piece of knowledge from his marriage, that he has to prove, right? It's an interesting take on what a hero is. And I liked Elizabeth's comment about the sex in Greek mythology, because Odysseus has sex at least 3 times in this book, which is, I don't know, I don't think it makes it to the Disney versions. But Elizabeth wrote, they delighted in pleasures and weren't shy about it, which I thought was a great way to sum it up in a very positive way, because the Greeks definitely looked on earthly pleasures as good things. Again, the afterlife was not a good place, so things like sex and emotion, right? People have talked about the emotions that the male heroes express a lot, right? These were things to be lauded and loved and celebrated, right? Sex and earthly pleasures, feasts and emotions, things like this, right? So anyways, I'm glad everybody enjoyed the Odyssey. Just a couple things coming up in the course. I'm talking a long time, but the Odyssey is great. I'm going to mark your proposals soon. I'm going to start on them today, and then I'll get your reflections later this week. This week we're working on Athenian theater very briefly, and we're going to read the Oedipus. So one thing to remember is, Homer, the Odyssey, the Iliad, written in the 8th century, we think, dictated and then written down. So around 700-ish BCE, right? 750 to 650 is the kind of range people give. So let's say 700. And then Oedipus, we know, was performed at the Dionysian festival in 429 BCE. That's the first time it was performed. So we're looking at about 300 years into the future, right? Roughly. Right? We're jumping 300 years into the future as we get into Athenian theater and Oedipus specifically. And think about that. 300 years is a long time, right? We tend to think of like Greek mythology as just like one block of, all the texts are written at the same time, basically. But that's definitely not so. The people writing 300 years, as we're looking at with Oedipus, had a very different usage of myth. So myth, even though there is this religious component to their festivals, it would have been a very different understanding of what myth and religion, how they fit together, right? So something to keep in mind as you read the Oedipus. It's just a very different world than Homer was writing in, or at least telling his stories in. So that's what we're doing this week. I hope you enjoy the Oedipus, one of my favorite plays. This week as well, your research report and your outline for your term paper are due on Sunday, June 26th. I'll have a research guide up today or tomorrow. I'm getting a librarian to put that together just to give you an expert taking you through some of the Chafee resources. And then next week is all about the paper. So we'll have peer editing. We'll do that online, of course, using a discussion forum. So you need to post your rough draft by Tuesday, June 28th. and then you'll have a couple days to give feedback to each other, and then your final the final draft is due on Friday when the course wraps up, Friday, June 31st. So things are going to move quickly in the next week and a half. Your rough draft is due exactly 1 week from now, so if you've been putting it off, start working on your paper. On the plus side, there's no final exam, so it's all about the paper, basically, in Oedipus from now on. Okay, so have a good week. Please email me if you have any questions or concerns.